Today we're going to discuss blood vessels, which are the other important structures in the circulatory system next to the heart or along with the heart. And there's a few different types of blood vessels that we want to discuss. So first of all, let's just look at them sort of in a definition type way, and then we'll draw some pictures to illustrate. So, arteries. Let's start with arteries. Arteries, now when they're large, we call them arteries. And when they're smaller, we call them arterioles. It means a little smaller arteries. Okay, but for the most part, the properties of these are the same. Just one's a little smaller than the other, and there might be some small differences. So basically, these two things are thicker, muscular vessels that can contract and relax. So these muscles inside, the smooth muscles that line the entire wall of the arteries and arterioles, can squeeze and relax and squeeze and relax to control the blood pressure inside there. So blood is under pressure, okay, in these arteries, because the heart is pumping that left ventricle. It squeezes very, very hard, and it pushes the blood. It forces the blood through the arteries away from the heart. Okay, so there's another point we can make, is that the arteries lead away from the heart. Well, let's not put lead. Let's put they carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so they're leading away from the heart. So they're essentially all connected from the aorta. The aorta leaves the heart. It leaves the left ventricle, remember, that big, thick blood vessel, and it arches up over top of the heart, and it branches off into arteries that go sort of upwards towards the head and the arms, and then the rest of it arcs back down behind the heart and branches off into arteries that go to the rest of the body. So ultimately, all the blood in these arteries has come from the aorta, and it's come from the left ventricle, which has pumped or contracted. So it creates blood pressure, and the blood pressure can be controlled. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add another point here up on top. These are under pressure. When we talk about blood pressure, it's in our arteries. When we get to veins later, we'll see that they have very low pressure, and we'll see why. Okay, blood away from the heart. That means that in most cases, arteries carry blood that has already been to the lungs, and it's been oxygenated. So it's going to the body to deliver that oxygen, with the exception, of course, of the pulmonary arteries, which are leading from the right ventricle to the lungs. So those are arteries that actually contain deoxygenated blood, but that's because the heart is a double pump, right? And it pumps sometimes, half the time it's pumping blood to the lungs and back, while at the same time, the left side of the heart is pumping through the body. Okay, thicker muscular vessels carry blood away from the heart under pressure. Okay, so let's move on then. We'll leave that for now, and we'll talk about veins. And when they're larger, we call them veins. The largest, the Vena Cava, gets its own special name, and it enters the heart both from the top and the bottom. Right, there's sort of two of them. But we call them venules when they're a little bit smaller. But essentially, these are the same sort of structures, just they differ in size a little bit. So I'm going to put a line up here to differentiate. Okay? So the veins are under little to no pressure. There's very little pressure inside veins. So that means that they are thinner. They still have muscles in their walls, thinner muscle lining. You don't really need to contract it and sort of. You can also imagine in the arteries, they have to be strong enough to withstand the pressure, otherwise they'll blow open. So the thick walls in the arteries help to control that, but also they help to just make the vessels strong enough to withstand the pressure. But the veins don't need a thick muscular lining because the pressure is low and the blood is just sort of kind of trickling on through there. So they're thinner muscle lining. Of course, they carry blood back to the heart. And again, most of them carry deoxygenated blood because this is blood that's returning from the body after the oxygen has been exchanged. We find higher levels of carbon dioxide in veins because they're bringing that back to be expelled. With the exception of course, the pulmonary veins, which are also leading back to the heart from the lungs, but they all obviously contain oxygenated blood. So the little lung section of the cycle is sort of backwards to this, but everything else in the body follows this general principle, carrying blood back to the heart. Now, they don't have strong muscle walls for contracting and expanding, but what they do have is they have a system of valves to prevent backflow of blood. Because there's very little pressure, think about it, the blood in the veins is not being pushed or forced very strongly. It's more of a slow trickle. And so it would be very easy for that blood, especially when you're standing up. Think about your legs. If you're standing up, the blood is trying to trickle upwards towards your heart, but gravity is pulling it down. The blood would just kind of slosh back down into your feet, and it would stay there. So the veins have these little valves every so often in them to prevent blood from flowing backwards. Because there's no pressure to keep it moving in the right direction. Okay. So we'll draw ourselves a couple of pictures just to get the idea. Here's an artery, and over here we'll draw a vein by comparison. All right. So the artery, we'll draw a little tube like this, and we'll make a circle like this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make these walls thick. We're going to color them in like this. Thick. These are smooth muscles, a kind of muscle tissue. Smooth muscles we typically don't control on our own. Some of them we can, but most of the time these muscles are controlled by the brain without telling us. For instance, you can't concentrate on your arteries and make them contract like you can your arm or leg muscles, right? You can't do that. So they're involuntary, their control, right? That's sort of, there's the inside of the artery. Okay? And then a vein, which I'll draw, again, I'm going to use the blue and red. Remember, we use that sort of convention. A vein has thinner walls. So the walls of the vein are thinner, and I'll get my crayon here, shade it in. But inside the vein, there are sort of little flaps, these valves, which are, let me use sort of a purple, green might show up better. So inside the vein, there are little flaps that sort of they're very similar to what happens inside the heart. Every so often, there are these little flaps that work like this. So the blood flow inside here is in this direction. That's the blood flow direction back to the heart. And you can see that if the sloshed backwards like this, these little flaps would just kind of be forced together. They would close. Let me draw a little picture up above here to show what it would look like. If the blood is pushed against them, then what would happen is they would sort of get pushed flat and they would stick like this when there was pressure this way. And that would prevent the blood from leaking backwards in the veins. These are not present in arteries. Arteries don't need this. We can draw blood flow in the artery. It doesn't really matter, the direction of blood flow in the artery. It's coming from the heart. But it's the pressure, the high pressure caused by the ventricular contraction, right? The left ventricle contracting, that forces the blood forward. It would be like trying to go backwards against a very strong current in a river. You can't do that. So we don't need valves in arteries. But in the veins we do. A very common thing that happens to people as they age is in the legs and ankles. This is where it's the hardest part of the body to keep the blood moving in the right direction. When you lie down, right, it's a gravity. So think about this. If you're lying down in a lying down position, like this, that's kind of a weird looking body. Let me change that. Let's put our legs sort of this way. Okay, got your hands behind your head. You're just kind of relaxing there, lying down. Well, if you think about it, your heart is here. And so the blood is flowing basically back and forth across your body. And it's a little bit easier for the heart to do its thing. But when you stand up, your heart is here. And so blood has to move in an up and down direction. And blood from down in the leg area, in the veins, has to work its way upwards against the force of gravity. So these little valves that we were drawing are critically important. But what happens to people over time is sometimes these valves can get faulty. They can wear out. And the veins lose their ability to keep the blood moving upwards. And what happens then is the blood starts to pool, and it causes the veins to swell up. And you get what's called varicose veins. And if you've ever noticed older people, especially if you look at their ankles or around their feet, you might see that some of their blood vessels are all sort of swollen up. And that's because the blood is not as effectively moving as these valves break down over time or lose their elasticity, their effectiveness. So varicose veins is a condition we see when these valves in the veins here, when they fail and don't do their job properly. There are certain things that contribute to varicose veins. Another thing that also helps the blood move up the legs, right? So an important thing, so let's write a little something here. Let's go back up to our valves. Valves prevent blood from flowing backwards, okay? Maybe we'll go under since you probably don't have room. Veins also rely on muscle contractions. I'm going to put skeletal muscle contractions to help squeeze blood along. So what that means is in your leg, you have big muscles, your calf muscles, your thigh muscles that are constantly squeezing and contracting every time you stand and walk and move around. And these contractions, when the muscles squeeze, they happen to be squeezing against some of the blood vessels that are running near the muscles. And so muscle contractions can also help squeeze blood back upwards against gravity. So effectively, your veins rely on the valves, but also on the nearby muscles, skeletal muscles, to contract, to help move the blood up your legs. So guess what happens if you don't use those muscles, if you don't exercise? If you just stand around a lot, but you don't actually walk or move or run or jump, the muscles are not pushing the blood as effectively either. So those two factors together combine to make blood pool in the legs. And so older people have two bad habits, right? Well, one bad habit. They don't exercise enough. And they tend to stand around a lot, or they sit in a desk all day. So the blood is pooling in their legs. And so varicose veins start to occur as you get into your 40s and 50s and so on. And they get worse and worse. And I'm sure you've all seen that they're kind of unsightly. They're not necessarily a health issue unless they get very serious. But for most people, they're just unsightly. One of the things that we think leads to the development of varicose veins in women is the constant wearing of high-heeled shoes. Because high-heeled shoes put your feet in a different position. And what they do is they effectively cause the calf muscle to be in a shortened position all the time. And that changes the way the muscles work against the blood vessels. And it also means that you're effectively just kind of walking on your tiptoes all the time when you're in high-heel shoes. So you're not really using the muscles as they were designed to be used in their full capacity. So it seems that high-heel shoes might be, now wearing them once or twice a week or whatever, but some people wear high-heel shoes all day long at work or whatever because it's fashionable, but unfortunately that can cause you to end up with varicose veins or at least contribute to it later in life. Okay, so there's veins and arteries. That's the idea. Now, we want to talk about how they sort of connect, because obviously they have to connect. So here's the deal. We're going to draw ourselves a little picture. So first we'll draw, let's see. So here's the heart. Oh, I wanted to draw that in a different color. I'll draw the heart in red. There it is, nice little heart. Okay. Now, the first blood vessel that leaves the heart is a thick blood vessel. So I'll use this thick line here. And here is the aorta. Okay, so the aorta branches. That's the main artery leaving the heart. But then what it does is it very quickly branches off. So I'm going to put some smaller branches. It branches up to go up to the bottom of the body. And then up to the top of the body. And as it moves down, it branches again into smaller and smaller and smaller arteries. And these arteries reach out all through your body. Interestingly enough, when you look at your own body, you can see some blood vessels in your arms and legs primarily. But it's very hard to see arteries because arteries usually run deep inside the body. So they're protected. Because they're under high pressure, if an artery ever gets cut, it squirts. Every time the heart beats, blood would shoot out of the artery. And it will shoot about, up to a meter above your arm. And you cut an artery in your arm, every time your heart beats, blood will squirt out really high into the air. And of course, it's very serious because you'll lose blood fast and you will die very quickly. So severing an artery is a very major, major problem. But severing a vein is not so bad. When you sever a vein, there's no pressure, so it just kind of oozes. And this is typically what we see when we cut ourselves. Blood just oozes out. Now, you can still lose a lot of blood if you cut yourself in a very bad place or a very large cut. But it's a slower process, so it's usually not as life-threatening. And so the arteries are all tucked deep in our tissues to avoid them being exposed to dangerous things. But the veins can be more close to the surface, and so those are the ones we see. Everything you see on your arm is a vein. It's very hard to see arteries. Okay, we'll talk about where we can find some arteries and feel them, at least shortly. Now, so what happens is these things go all over the body, right? Well, then what happens is the body somehow exchanges the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, and then the whole process works backwards, and these things come back into the heart. So let me go back to my big line here. So we have coming from here, right? This is the top of the body. Actually, I'm going to ignore the fact. Let me just ignore the fact for a minute that there's a inferior and superior vena cava. For this flow chart, let's just focus on one. So there's both vena cavas coming back to the heart. And they're thick too. Maybe they're not, maybe a little thicker than that. And of course, what happens is they branch as well. So those branches have branched off, right? And those are coming from the body, right? So this is misleading. There, that's better. So the aorta, which is an artery, very soon branches off into arterioles, which are smaller arteries. And then something sort of interesting happens when we get to the body. And the venules, sort of on their way back, they gather together into larger veins. And then eventually back, this is the vena cava here. This last one, I didn't label them right there. But what's interesting is what happens right here. How does the blood go from the small arteries into the venules? And of course, we've already seen this mechanism, but we're going to study it in a little more detail today. And it's, of course, the capillary network. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw another picture for you that shows what's happening inside this green circle. And of course, it has to happen on a microscopic level. It's very small. So basically, if we start with a large artery, that very quickly begins to branch. And then it branches again. And then it begins to branch, and I'm going to change my pen size here, into tiny little branches like this. And they can overlap and they swing all around. And these branches can also branch. Something like that. Okay? Now, we'll color this a little bit. So we have, so this is an artery, main artery, right here branching off into slightly smaller arteries, but eventually it branches into these, what we would call arterioles. Okay? And I'm drawing this very short. These can be longer, but again, I'm trying to sort of preserve space on the board. So this is, again, just a sort of a diagrammatic picture. Let's draw a little more branching there and there. Something like that. Okay? So here we have the artery. Then we have this sort of smaller area here of what we would call arterioles. And then we have this region of the tiniest blood vessels, which are so small that only one blood cell wide. Only blood cells go single file. So microscopic blood cells are sneaking through these one at a time, sort of. They're very, very tiny. Now, here's the hard part. What we have to do is we have to sort of draw this sort of backwards on the other side. So let me take my thing here, and let me go over here and draw a relatively thick, and then maybe some branches. Like this, branching again, branching one more time. And as they branch, they get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So branching again, and this one sort of branching up like this. Okay, and down here, this one reaching over. And then, I'll get my smaller pen, these branches get smaller and smaller. And then what we have to do is we have to make them sort of wiggle around, and we want them to sort of join up with every spot on the other side where I left a hanging. So every one has to carry through. And of course, they can branch several times. Just kind of, it doesn't matter where they go, just branch them all through there. And that's the idea, is that they all sort of eventually link up, so nobody is left untouched. Like that. And then we can color in this side with a crayon blue, our vein. And these would be the venules, the smaller and smaller veins. And there's a reason why we colored it blue, right? We'll see that as well. So something like that. I mean, it's a reasonably good picture. So this section, well, let me label the other side, I guess, first. So what we have on the other side are veins, which are the large ones. And these sort of smaller veins are the venules. And then again, we have very, very tiny ones. So I'm going to put a sort of a circle around this area right here, where all the tiny ones are. So what this is called is it's called a capillary network. These are called capillaries. Whoops, let's get small. Capillary network. Some people pronounce it capillaries, but I have an issue with that because when we write the word, you're going to see it has one P and two L's. Capillaries. Capillaries, or capillary network. Let's put it with a Y. Oh, and it's an R. It's an A there. Capillary. Oh boy, I'm talking and spelling at the same time, and I shouldn't be. So capillary network. Network because it's all interconnected like that. Capillary, right? So you see the double L in the word capillary. Well, if you pronounced it capillary, we would spell it like this, using the rules of English with a double P, because the double consonant is where the stress is. So I like to be a sort of traditionalist and pronounce it capillary because of the way it's spelled. Capillary network. Now, what's going on here? Well, this black dotted line that I've drawn will represent any nearby cell. Every cell in the body, every single cell in the body is near a capillary network like this of some kind. And so what happens is, at the capillary network, these vessels are so small, they're so thin that molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide can slide right through the cell walls or the cell membranes and in and out of the cells very easily. So because of these tiny blood vessels and the fact that this is so small, what happens here is that oxygen is from the artery, oxygen is flowing out, going to the body cells. It's squeezing right through the membranes of the red blood cells that carry it, and right through the membranes of the capillaries, the tiny little blood vessels, and into the tissue of the body. So it's not like the blood vessels open up and blood pours onto the cells. The blood just kind of goes by. The taxi goes by on the freeway, and the oxygen is able to hop off. But oxygen can only do this on a microscopic level, so we need to have these tiny, tiny blood vessels. And then, of course, the carbon dioxide is coming from the body and going into the blood. And, of course, the blood is flowing, the blood flow direction across the capillary is this way. It comes from the arteries. It delivers the oxygen to the cells, picks up the carbon dioxide, and then goes back into the venules and veins. So this is the way the blood is flowing through the capillaries. So that's why we use a different color, to show that change. It's really just the same blood vessel, right? They're all connected. It's a single tube or path. But We have to get it down to the microscopic level, and we have to have a blood vessel pretty much next to every cell in the body. So your body is actually made of, you're like a giant tree. These blood vessels start off thick, but they get smaller and smaller and smaller until they're everywhere, all through your body on the level of cells. And these capillary networks are where this happens. Now, important capillary networks occur around the alveoli of the lungs. We talked about that. So the lung tissue also ends in very tiny little microscopic sacs, the alveoli. And that's blood then wraps around the alveoli. So the black circle on our picture could represent an alveolus in the lungs and the exchange of gas. This could also represent the microvilli of an intestine, where nutrients have to get into the bloodstream from the intestine, right, from our digestive system. It's not always CO2. It could be that nutrients are entering into the bloodstream. So we could put nutrients here, nutrients that are, if this happened to be not the lungs but the intestine, nutrients would be going into the blood as it passed through or over the intestinal microvilli, and then that would be carried by the veins back to the heart, so those nutrients could then be pumped all throughout the rest of the body. So it's not just oxygen and carbon dioxide. Capillary networks occur also in the intestines to bring tiny molecules of food in, but they have to be so small that they can squeeze across the membranes, either squeezing right through like oxygen does, or be transported through by the protein gates in the membranes. They can be pulled through the gates. But still, you have to be small, which is why digestion requires us to break everything down to small, tiny things. You can't just take a piece of cake and shove it in your veins, right? It doesn't work. You have to break everything down and get to the smallest microscopic level for molecules to be able to move through cell membranes, through the protein gates, and in and out of cells, right? So if we were to draw another picture, let's try and draw another picture like this, just to kind of give you the idea. Let's draw the cells that line the capillary. So the capillary is a tube, but if we zoom in even closer, these would be the cells that form the capillary. So I'll put a little nucleus in them. So there's the tube, the capillary tube. Inside here are red blood cells going through one at a time. Red blood cells look sort of like donuts. They have a little dent in them. Let me color them a bit. Maybe that'll look better. They don't have a nucleus, but they have a sort of a dense, they sort of are just kind of like this with a dent in the middle. They don't really have a nucleus. They've given up their nucleus because they're so highly specialized, and what they simply do is transport oxygen and whatnot. So what happens is oxygen or nutrients. So if this is the lungs, it's primarily carbon dioxide that will be brought into the lungs by the arteries. Let's go back to my pen, and maybe in black. Okay, let's pretend that we're coming past an intestinal villi. So over here in green, I'm going to draw this capillary is going by, and sort of next to it are the cells of the intestinal villi, right? So this is wrapping around the cells of the intestine wall. So let's write here intestinal microvilli, those very, very tiny projections. They're made of cells. And then let's write here the capillary. And let's write red blood cells inside the capillary. So oxygen is inside these, or sorry, not oxygen, we were talking about food particles. So there's nutrients. I'm going to use little N's for nutrients. Nutrients, nutrients, nutrients. Oh, sorry, backwards, rats. Let's got carried away. The nutrients are inside the intestine. So the region down below here, here's the nutrients. They're in the intestine, right? So if I make this bigger, there's the intestinal villi cells again. So this is the intestinal canal. This is the inside of the intestine. The intestine inside, where the food is. It's gone through, right? Sloshing through your intestines. So it's full of these nutrients that we've broken down. Nutrients, nutrients, nutrients. So the nutrients now have to go on a little journey. They have to slide right through the gates. They have to be uploaded, right? They have to be uploaded in. So the nutrients begin to be pulled into the cells of the microvilli. Well, then they have to be moved, so they go inside here. Then they have to be loaded through the cells like this that line the capillary. And then they have to be pushed right into the bloodstream. Now, sometimes they just float around in the bloodstream like this. The nutrients go into the bloodstream. And once they go into the bloodstream, then they can follow the bloodstream to the rest of the body and be delivered to other cells in the same way. It just works backwards. When this blood vessel flows near a muscle cell in your arm, these nutrients can squeeze right back through and back in. So you see, it's only the nutrients that actually cross the barrier. The blood stays locked in the vessels. It never splish or splashes out. But the miracle of active and passive transport through cell membranes, right? And so remember, I drew those black lines. Well, we can zoom in even closer. We can zoom in to what's going on right there and see what actually is happening now that we understand how cells work. What's happening is you've got a membrane. This is the cell membrane. That red line on the green lines I drew are basically these cell membranes. Here are the little tails inside, and maybe I'll put a little purple protein molecule here, blah, 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 big windy string-like thing, which can form a gate. Remember all this from when we learned about cells. So see, you can't forget because this is part of the process. So nutrients, when they move across the red line or the green line, they go like this. They move through the protein gate. They're pulled through. Or if they're small enough, like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they can just kind of wiggle their way right through here and slide right through the membrane. That's how they get through. So we've done about 4 different levels of zoom here, right? We've got our picture here. So we're looking at now, when I drew the next picture, I basically zoomed in to one little spot here, like this. And we drew the actual cells. There's the capillary in red passing by something in the body. That's how it works. So essentially, it's picking up stuff at the intestines, and it's also picking up stuff at the lungs and giving carbon dioxide away. When it flows past a muscle cell or a liver cell, it can pick up things from the liver or drop things off in the same way. So the picking up and dropping off is on a very microscopic level. And that's basically how the capillary network works. Now, I want to go back and just mention something. The artery here is under pressure, remember? Because of the pushing from the left ventricle, pushing, pressure this way. But when you take something under pressure and you distribute that pressure into a whole bunch of tiny little tubes, the total pressure is the same, but it's now divided up into a bunch of little tubes, which means the pressure in each tube is now much less. Does that make sense? All the pressure in one tube is a lot of pressure on one tube. Well, when you divide it up, you get a little bit of that pressure divided into many tubes. So what happens as you go across here as the blood flows is there's a pressure loss. So the capillary network loses all that pressure because it's all divided into, and then when you get over to the vein side, you're now in a low pressure situation that we talked about. And the low pressure means the blood just trickles, and don't forget the veins have valves. to help prevent the backflow of blood. So these veins, we can draw a few valves in there because there's no pressure to push them. All right? Okay. We can talk about blood pressure in another video. We'll do a separate video on blood pressure and what that means. And we'll also talk about some other issues and things that can go wrong with your heart and blood vessels and conditions and health issues. But for today, I think that's probably good enough. We've kind of hammered how the blood vessels actually work.